Welcome, everyone. I'm Assistant Professor Elif from the Department of International Relations, Yaşar University, and I will have the privilege to moderate today's online seminar, which is taking place as part of the Yaşar University Graduate School online seminar series. We have Mr. Espen Kjoenoe as our presenter today. Before introducing him and his presentation title, I would like to first of all remind all the participants that this session is being recorded. I also would like to bring to your attention that after Mr. Kjoenoe finishes his presentation, without exceeding the usual 40-minute time limit, we will move on to Q&A. So we will make sure to have some time for questions. If you happen to have questions while listening to the presenter, please type them in the chat box. Before giving the floor to Espen, I would like to introduce him. He's from Norway, but he's also quite internationally oriented. He's currently based at Charles University in Czech Republic, Prague, studying for a master's degree in geopolitics. Previously, Espen received a bachelor's degree in international studies with history at Inland University of Applied Sciences in Norway. And he also has a master's degree in international relations at Yaşar University. Actually, I had the pleasure to supervise Mr. Kjoenoe's master's thesis when he was based at our department. His presentation today is based on his master's thesis, and it is titled Power Dynamics in the Arctic, a Return to Great Power Competition. Without further ado, I would like to offer the floor to Mr. Kjoenoe. Espen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be back, at least online. Here's our university. As Elif said, it's Power Dynamics in the Arctic, Return to Great Power Competition. Okay, there you go. Agenda, first I'm going to do introduction, research aim, methodology. Then I'm going to go into empirical chapters, natural resources, military strategic priorities, trade routes, UNCLOS, and then conclusion and questions, if there may be some. The areas inside the Arctic Circle covers roughly 4% of the Earth's surface. This vast area for a long time overlooked due to harsh climate in the area and was deemed inaccessible. And since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Arctic was seen as a region of cooperation between the actors involved in the region. However, the ice caps in the Arctic Ocean are melting more and more every year. Most of the world see this as a looming disaster, but for the Arctic nations, this is also an opportunity to get access to brand new ocean and to its resources. Tensions in the Arctic rose in 2001 when Russia officially submitted a proposal to the UN Commissions on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, CLS. Russia's proposal was to establish new outer limits for the Russian continental shelf beyond the previously established 200 nautical miles. So one of the arguments of the Russian side was that the Lomonosov Ridge is the extension of the Eurasian continent. Denmark and Canada also proposed similar territorial claims that would overlap with Russia's borders proposal. The ridge attracted international attention yet again after the 2007 expedition called Arctica 2007. In this expedition, Russia performed the first ever crew descent to the ocean bottom at the North Pole as a part of a research related to Russian territorial claims in the area in 2001. This incident intensified the global interest in the Arctic when Russia planted its flag on the seafloor on the North Pole. Since this incident, 5 Arctic countries, namely Norway, Denmark with the autonomous country of Greenland, Russia, Canada, and the United States have been in dispute over the territories in the Arctic Ocean. This incident started what the geopolitician Klaus Dodds referred to as the scramble for the Arctic. Due to its significance, this research takes the planting of the Russian flag on the seafloor under the North Pole in 2007 as its starting point. The research question, my research question is, how have Russia's and the United States policy priorities in the Arctic changed since 2007? I've chosen to compare and contrast the changes that have been happening in the United States and Russia's domestic and foreign policy priorities with regards to the 4 different dimensions, which follows as military strategic priorities, energy security, trade routes, and how each of these countries are positioning themselves within the framework of the United Nations Convention for the Laws of the Seas, also known as UNCLOS. The research investigates how the United States and Russia's domestic and foreign policies have changed on these key dimensions, and especially regarding UNCLOS, how each of these countries position themselves within the context of this international document. The central purpose of this thesis was to offer an in-depth analysis of how Russia's and United States' domestic and foreign policies in the Arctic have changed. There's been a lack of research regarding the Arctic for a long time. This has, however, changed somehow in the recent years. Most of the research regarding the Arctic focus on either military security or just energy politics in the Arctic. This research aims to fill the gap within existing Arctic studies when it comes to combining several different dimensions and how they've changed and how intertwined these dimensions are. However, due to recent events, this research focuses on the time period between 2007 and 2022 until the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. This research recognizes that certain changes in any of these dimensions may occur or might have already occurred due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. However, due to funding and time limits, no detailed analysis of the recent events could be conducted. I will be touching upon this topic a bit in my conclusion part. In order to answer the research question of this research, the comparative case study has been considered as the most adequate methodological approach. A case-oriented approach will be used in this research because it aims at offering an in-depth analysis of how Russia's and the United States' domestic and foreign policies in the Arctic have changed in 2007. Another reason for using a case-oriented approach is the limited number of cases that will be looked into, namely the United States and Russia, because a case-oriented approach primarily focuses on a limited number of cases, which are then analyzed in a range of dimensions in a detailed way with the purpose of enhancing the understanding of the units that are involved. The United States and Russia have been chosen as a case due to their position in the international system as great powers, as well as their historic influence in the Arctic. However, some might argue that there's a country that should be added, namely China, because of their presence in the Arctic in recent years, with them declaring themselves as a near Arctic state. China is not added in this thesis because of the time period I'm focusing on. I will, as mentioned, be focusing on the time period 2007 until before the Russian invasion on Ukraine in February 24th, 2022. Considering that China declared itself as a near Arctic state in 2018, this would be too limited of a time frame to analyze how their domestic and foreign policy in the Arctic has changed. How has the United States' domestic and foreign policies changed on natural resources in the Arctic? The decrease in polar ice in the Arctic can potentially alter the options for oil and gas exploration for the United States. Even though these areas are experiencing warmer temperature, exploration will be costly due to the harsh climate in the Arctic. The harsh climate will also make the development of infrastructure that is necessary to produce, store, and transport oil and gas from newly discovered deposits not only costly, but also challenging. Despite the harsh climate in the Arctic, the United States has in recent years increased their interest in exploration and exploitation of offshore as well as onshore oil and gas in the region. The United States has already started mapping the projects of the areas beyond the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, EEZ, in an attempt to support future claims. Some of these areas are expected to contain large amounts of oil and gas. There are several factors that affect the potential of onshore energy development in the Arctic. One factor is the melting of permafrost. Permafrost is ground, soil, rock, or other materials remains frozen from year to year. The Arctic permafrost has historically been used as a solid foundation base for the infrastructure in the region. The melting of the permafrost in the region will create challenges because it makes the infrastructure such as roads and buildings more unstable, and in the worst case, they might collapse. Another factor is the high transportation cost. Onshore exploration and exploitation of energy require transportation access to deliver the necessary machinery and supplies, as well as transporting the product to the market. In most cases, onshore facilities can be accessed by roads, but recent changes in the Arctic climates have affected the accessibility of onshore development. Current infrastructure in the region, such as ice roads, have been heavily affected by the climate changes occurring in the region. These ice roads are built and used when temperatures fall and remain below a threshold. But in recent years, as temperature rises, the roads have been weakened and they might reach a point where they can no longer be used. The United States has responded to these challenges by increasing its interest in offshore oil and gas development in the Arctic. Interest in offshore oil and gas exploration increased after a US Geological Survey was published in 2008. The USGS stated the following: extensive Arctic continental shelves may constitute the geographically largest unexplored prospective area for petroleum remaining on Earth. The USGS estimates that 90 billion barrels of oil, nearly 1,700 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, 44 billion barrels of natural gas liquids may remain to be discovered in the Arctic, including both US and international resources north of the Arctic Circle. The US Department of the Interior Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has estimated that there's approximately 25 billion barrels of oil, as well as 124 trillion cubic feet of natural gas located in the US outer continental shelf. This is equivalent to roughly 25% of the world's undiscovered natural gas and 10% of its oil. Although not all of these resources may be possible to recover because of the lack of technology, infrastructure, or the high cost of exploitation. How has concerns over possible environmental effects of oil and gas in the region has changed in the United States during various administrations. Since the 1980s, the US policymakers rejected any regulated planning and permitting, effectively banning any oil and gas exploration and exploitation in Bristol Bay in the North Aleutian Basin, with an end date of 2004. However, in 2004, the US Congress decided to not extend these bans, but this changed with the election of Barack Obama in 2008. President Obama focused heavily on the preservation of the Arctic climate. During the Obama administration, the previous moratorium bans on gas and oil leasing in the basin was reinstated. Obama later expanded these moratoriums to several other areas in the Arctic, including the Chukchi Sea, Beaufort Sea, and specific areas in the North Bering Sea. These moratoriums effectively meant that oil and gas exploration and exploitation was now banned in a significant part of the US Arctic. However, in 2017, Donald Trump issued an executive change to end President Obama's moratoriums on oil and gas exploration and exploitation in all of the aforementioned areas, except for in Basin Bay. The Trump administration stated their intention of promoting offshore oil and gas development in the Arctic and issued a drafted offshore oil and gas leasing program for 2019, a program that was intended to last for 5 years. However, the same year, the U.S. District Court of the District of Alaska rejected the possibility for this executive order, stating the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act gives the president the authority to make withdrawals, but not to revoke prior presidential withdrawals. How has Russia's domestic and foreign policies changed on natural resources in the Arctic? One of the main interests in the Arctic for Russia is its natural resources. It's not only the potential of natural resources offshore, but also the onshore that is alluring to the Russian Federation. The Russian Ministry for Industry and Energy estimates that within the next 10 years, Russia could be extracting up to 160 billion cubic meters of gas and 100 million tons of oil from the Arctic. There are, however, a growing number of people voicing concerns about the estimates. They are saying that these estimates are insufficient. According to the independent environmental foundation Bellona, even in the well-known western part of the Arctic, only up to 12% of the Barents Sea reserves have been explored. Even Russia's own sources are contradictory to the estimates by the Ministry for Industry and Energy, where 2007 scientific expedition expedition put forward figures that are only 1/5 of the estimates for the Barents and Kara Seas. In 2008, Gazprom launched the Yamal Mega Project. The Yamal Mega Project is a new gas production center focusing on exploring and exploiting the vast resources that exist in the Yamal Peninsula, and it's also focusing development and innovating the infrastructure to overcome the harsh climates and environment in the Arctic. Gazprom, which is visible in this picture, also plans to build more than 12,000 kilometers of new pipeline, as well as developing a Yamal Europe gas pipeline, extending more than 4,000 kilometers all the way to Germany. The Yamal mega project is projected to become a major contributor to the Russian gas industry. In 2018, the center produced 87.4 billion cubic meters of gas, but they project to produce up to 360 billion cubic meters of gas per year by 2030. If Russia also develops Arctic shipping, delivering liquefied natural gas by tankers will release some of the pressure on Russia's aging pipeline system. However, there are a lot of challenges for the exploitation of natural gas in the Arctic. One of them is inaccessibility of some of the potential resources, meaning that some resources do not necessarily translate to potential reserves because they might not be extractable. Moreover, estimated reserves are not necessarily proven reserves. Another issue is that proven reserves may not always be commercially recoverable. The US Geological Survey does not take into consideration the link between the cost of exploitation and development. For instance, the International Energy Agency calculates that the cost of exploiting resources in the Arctic is between $40 up to $100 per barrel, whereas in the Middle Eastern reserves are calculated to be between $10 and $40 per barrel. Another challenge is the lack of infrastructure. This is still a major issue, although the Gazprom Yamal mega project is updating its infrastructure in the area. In 2010, the Russian government issued a strategy of the development of oil and gas resources in the Arctic for the next 10 years. This concluded that domestic oil sector in Russian territory is at a vital state. The Russian government also stated the following: without reforms, Russia's oil output will fall far short of what would be needed to meet growth targets. Russia continues to believe that the Arctic holds the key to its energy future, with over 80% of its gas reserves and 70% of its oil reserves located there. The majority of these resources are found in the Barents Sea and Kara Sea, but another region, the Lomonosov and Mendeleev ridges, may prove to be more profitable in the future. These ridges are at the heart of Russia's territorial claims to UNCLOS. There are also a lot of different challenges that could increase the cost of exploiting, as well as amplifying the risk of an Arctic-based energy strategy for Russia. One of these challenges is how technically challenging it is to exploit the Arctic resources. Drilling under the extreme Arctic conditions requires specific equipment and knowledge that the Russians are still far from possessing. Even with the lack of necessary knowledge and equipment, the Russian authorities launched a strategy in 2006 for the development of its oil and gas in the region until 2020. There have been numerous technical issues with this plan, and a lot of them have been delayed for almost a decade due to the aforementioned lack of knowledge and equipment. How has Russia's domestic and foreign policies changed the military strategic priorities in the Arctic? The military significance of the Arctic decreased throughout the 1990s. The Arctic went from being a region where the threat of military confrontation was high to a region where the common agenda among the Arctic countries are focusing on environmental protection, research cooperation, and economic interests. The US forces abandoned the Keflavik base in 2006, which is located in Iceland. And this was yet another sign that cooperation was now in the main interest in the Arctic. Another sign of the decreased military activity in the region was the nuclear capabilities of the Soviet Union and later Russia in the region. In 1989, the Soviet Union had around 200 operational nuclear submarines in the region. However, 7 years later, in 1996, only half of these were still in service. In the 1990s, Russia was focused on the Chechen War. The army now found themselves in a position where they could no longer conduct operations in the Arctic. The Russian Navy was also affected by the dissolution of the Soviet Union, It saw its share of defense budget drop by 14% down to only 9%. This meant that the Russian government had to undertake huge modernization efforts of its navy, and that's exactly what it did. In 2001, the Russian government launched an ambitious plan to transform the navy into the second most powerful navy in the world within the next 20 years. In order to become the second most powerful navy in the world, Russia also saw the need to upgrade its aerial activity. The Russian Air Force have for years been seen as old and obsolete. Russian flights over the Arctic fell from over 500 per year during the Soviet period to less than 30 during the 1990s. However, during the late 2000s, the Russian government has had an increased attention to upgrading the Russian Air Force. The result of this is an increased number of flights over the Arctic from 11 interception of Russian warplanes in the period of 1992 to 2005 to more than 45 interceptions from 2006 to 2011. Another example is the year 2010, where Russian strategic bombers carried out 10 missions in the vicinity of Norwegian airspace. This is just two less than the 2 previous years combined. Russia is prioritizing to defend what they call their historic right to rule over the region, as well as securing the territorial interest in the Arctic against NATO allied nations. Since 2008, Russia emphasized the development of military bases in the Arctic, as well as holding military exercises. In addition to this, Putin also intends to create a new military group in Murmansk, a force of more than 6,000 soldiers less than 100 kilometers from the Norwegian border. Since 2010, Russia invested over $1 billion to upgrade 13 of their airfields in the region in order to improve their search and rescue capabilities. They also invested in technological upgrades, such as upgrading the radar stations, including the development of so-called Sovka-2 radar systems. The Russian government also announced that their intentions to increasing their number of missile defense units deployed across the Arctic territory. The increased power projection by Russia highlights their ability to deny access to the Barents Sea for NATO or US forces, either by land, sea, or air. It is projected that the missions of the Northern Fleet will be more connected to protecting the economic interests of Russia in the Arctic. As a result, almost half of Russian Northern Fleet, which now represents about 60% of the entire Russian Navy, will be stationed near Novaya Zemlya. This archipelago is one of the most important strategic positions in the Arctic, since it allows for Russia to monitor and control the Northern Sea route. The Russian President Vladimir Putin has refused the allegations that Russia is militarizing the Arctic, even though they have heavily invested in new and upgraded military infrastructure in the Arctic. Putin claims that those concerns are absolutely unfounded. Putin also said that Russia is only restoring what they lost after the fall of the Soviet Union, claiming that Russia is willing to cooperate with other nations in the Arctic, stating, "I told our colleagues that I see no reason for concern. On the contrary, I'm deeply convinced that we can cooperate and must cooperate in this direction. I do not see a problem in the region that we cannot solve." Since the fall of the Soviet Union, the shared challenges of operating in the Arctic have been characterized by collaborating and cooperation between the countries involved in the Arctic. This status quo has, however, changed in recent years. Russia has developed Arctic strategies which collide with US interests. Russia seems to focus on strengthening their territorial claims in the region, as well as advancing their military capabilities in the area and develop their natural resources in the region. The United States has seen this development by Russia as something that creates the risk for the Arctic to turn into a contested space, where the United States will pursue the potential of using military as well as their economic power to gain influence in the area. The renewed interest from other great powers in the Arctic has raised questions about the United States' priorities and funding for the region. When the Arctic was generally characterized by low tensions and resources and cooperation, US policymakers may have viewed the region as requiring less attention and resources. However, after many years of unmet budgetary demands, the United States now appears to be addressing the deficiencies in its Arctic presence. US coordinator for the Arctic region, James P. DeHart, stated that if you look at what is happening in our system over the last couple of months, you will see that we are launching a comprehensive and an integrated diplomatic approach and engagement in the Arctic region. And that in a few years, people will look back at this summer of 2020 and see it as an important pivot point, a turning point with a more sustained and enduring attention by the United States to the Arctic region. Yet, the US policymakers will have to face several challenges. US policymakers have to define the real challenges in the Arctic and focus on the threat that they consider most urgent, as well as balance their military and non-military responses in the region. On the other hand, renewed power competition renewed power competition is not just happening in the Arctic. There's also a rising great power competition in other regions. Some argue that these regions are also in need of increased attention and resources by US policymakers. The Arctic sees itself competing against other regions for the attention and resources by US policymakers. Despite what seems like a greater desire by US policymakers for Arctic economic development, the US Arctic infrastructure remains outdated and with a very limited budget. After years of negligence of the development of US power capabilities in the Arctic, the result is that the United States is now struggling to maintain their presence in the region as other nations have prioritized and are prioritizing the Arctic as a region of future geostrategic value. There's always been a search for a shorter route from the Atlantic to Asia. And now with the ice in the Arctic Ocean melting, two new possibilities might open. These two are the Northwest Passage and the Northeast Passage, better known as the Northern Sea Route. The melting ice in the Arctic Ocean raises the possibility of saving several days of sailing, as well as thousands of miles between the Atlantic and Asia. The Northwest Passage in this picture is marked in red, runs through the Canadian Arctic ice. The other potential trading route in the Arctic Ocean, the Northern Sea Route, in this picture marked in blue, runs along Russia's northern borders from Murmansk in the west to Providenia in the east. This trading route was opened in 1931 solely as a domestic shipping route, and in 1991 it was opened from transit by foreign vessels. The NSR is by far the shortest shipping route between the European and the Asian market, and an ice-free Northern Sea Route could make the shipping from Western Europe to the markets in the Far East up to 20 to 40% shorter, making it at least 13 days shorter than the current route through the Suez Canal. The NSR has seen an immense increase in traffic. In 1997, only 2 ships sailed through the NSR, and the number of transits has increased from 48 in 2012 to more than 80 in 2021. How has the US domestic and foreign policies changed on trade routes in the Arctic? One of the concerns for US policymakers is the fact that NSR potentially can become a key shipping route between the European and the Asian market. Russia considers the NSR as a part of internal Russian waters. The United States, on the other hand, considers the Northern Sea Route to be international waters. This dispute between the United States and Russia can implicate not only the US-Russian relations and the issue of the Arctic, but it can also have ramifications for other countries and other parts of the world. For instance, the South China Sea. The reason for this is that since international law is universal in its application, a successful challenge by the United States in one part of the world has the potential to serve as precedent for challenging it in other parts of the world. The United States has seen the need for upgrading the Arctic infrastructure. The United States Committee on the Marine Transportation System identified a list of infrastructure improvements for Arctic navigation in 2013. The report issued a need for the United States to prioritize the improvements for Arctic navigation, especially its information infrastructure, i.e. weather forecasting, nautical charting, and ship tracking. The report also emphasizes the need to improve the emergency response capabilities for ship in distress. The US Army Corps of Engineers accompanied by the state of Alaska are also conducting studies on the possibilities of upgrading the US infrastructure in the Arctic, especially upgrading their ports in the area. Shipping in the Arctic poses a number of different challenges. Although climate change is causing the Arctic Ocean to become ice-free in the summer, this does not necessarily imply that the ocean will be ice-free in the long run. The lack of necessary operational rescue system is another challenge for traveling in the Arctic Ocean. Russia's response to this is a planned upgrade of their naval fleet. Russia plans to develop the next generation of its icebreaker fleet, designed to support navigation in the Northern Sea route. However, despite these planned improvements, the question remains as to how the 14,000 kilometers of Russian coastline will be secured. Another challenge that the Russians are facing is the lack of infrastructure. At the moment, the existing navigation aids and radio stations are largely insufficient, and their Arctic coastline is reportedly not covered by radio. And because of this, Russia has purchased such information from the United States and Canada. In response to the lack of infrastructure, the Russian government plans to establish a new generation international telecommunication network named Polarnet in order to create a unified communication space in the region. This need for technological improvements can be shown through the changes of Russian policies regarding the Northern Sea route. Most national decisions related to the economic growth of the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation in recent years have emphasized the Northern Sea route's critical role in the development of the Arctic. In December 2019, Russia launched the Northern Sea route infrastructure development plan for the period 2020 up to 2035. Alexandra Middleton, scientist at the Institution of Engineering and Technology in England, stated that this document appeared to be a roadmap full of solutions yet to be realized. However, there is no denying the determination of the Russian state to invest in the NSR and make it safe and attractive international shipping route in the future. To the Russians, the Northern Sea route is above all a domestic route and a major part of their strategy for developing the Arctic region. The Russian government hopes to increase the Arctic shipping and is ready to pay the price to overcome the necessary technological changes. The private companies involved in the Arctic shipping, on the other hand, set far more limited goals. As Marlene Laurel wrote in her book, Russia's Arctic Strategies and the Future of the Far North, even if the Arctic becomes an ice-free ocean, the technological challenges, the financial cost, and unpredictability do not guarantee its transformation into a major trading route. The United Nations Conventions on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, is an international treaty that established the rules governing all uses of oceans as well as their resource. The history of the UNCLOS we know today dates back to 1956 in Geneva, Switzerland, where the United Nations held its first conference on the law of the sea, also called UNCLOS I. During the 1982 UNCLOS Convention, Article 76 was implemented. This article is one of the most significant articles UNCLOS because it involves a definition of what constitutes a continental shelf. This article states that the continental shelf of a coastal state comprises the seabed and subsoil of submarine areas that extend beyond its territorial sea throughout the natural prolongation of its land territory to the outer edge of the continental margin, or to a distance of 200 nautical miles if the outer edge of the continental margin does not extend up to that distance. One of the main reasons for the United States to not sign UNCLOS when it was adopted in 1982 was because they were highly opposed to the seabed mining provisions of the treaty mentioned in Article 76. The reason for this is that the treaty established an international seabed authority. This authority mandates royalties on all deep seabed resources, which will be transferred to help developing nations. The United States is not a part of UNCLOS. They have, however, stated that they do accept the agreement and intend to act in accordance with the changes that have been made in UNCLOS. As previously mentioned, Russia's first submission was back in 2001, and in 2015 they submitted their revised version. The new revised version included not only the Lomonosov Ridge, but also the Mendeleev Ridge, as well as the Chuky Plateau. The United States never objected to this submission, either to the Division of Ocean Affairs nor to UNCLOS. In March 2021, Russia submitted 2 additions to the 2015 submission. The Russian submission with the 2 additions now captures more than 70% of the Arctic Ocean. The submissions and additions to the CLS by Russian government has been followed with an increase of Russian vessel charting the Arctic Ocean, especially the underwater Lomonosov Ridge. By doing this, Russia is attempting to show to the world that the Lomonosov Ridge is connected to Russia's extended continental shelf. Most analysts anticipate that the extended continental shelf application process will remain peaceful, since the parties participating appear to be determined to adhere to the United Nations regulations. Should the United States ratify UNCLOS? Rockford Weitz, a professor at Tufts University, claims that the United States not ratifying UNCLOS might be a disadvantage to American foreign policy in the Arctic. Weitz argued that if the United States were to ratify the agreement, they would have a stronger international legal position in the disputed waters in the Arctic. According to Weitz, ratifying UNCLOS would also enable the United States to make a claim of more than 386,000 square miles of the Arctic, whereas without ratifying UNCLOS, the United States would rely on traditional international law in order to attempt any maritime claims in the Arctic. This would, according to Weitz, weaken the U.S. international legal position, not only in the Arctic, but also in contested waters in the South China Sea. And other arguments that support Weitz come from Professor Ronjavart Ganan Almond at Georgetown University. He claims that even though the U.S. have not ratified UNCLOS, in practice, the U.S. has accepted and complies with nearly all of the treaty's provisions. Weitz further argues that it would be better to ratify UNCLOS because as of this moment, the U.S. as a non-party is not able to effect any future changes to the treaty, but still complies with nearly all of the treaty's provisions. However, not all support U.S. ratification of UNCLOS. Groves claims that the United States does not need to ratify the treaty to access the natural resources on its extended continental shelves. Instead, they should attempt to negotiate bilateral treaties with neighboring countries because, according to Groves, the United States has successfully maintained its Arctic interest since 1867. Conclusion and also future research. This thesis argued that regarding energy security, both nations have increased their interest in the region when it comes to the development of natural resources in the Arctic in an attempt to increase their material power capabilities. In the case of the United States and Russia, President Obama emphasized the importance of protecting the fragile Arctic climate, whereas President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin focused on the development of oil and gas exploration in the Arctic in an attempt to increase their material power capabilities in the region. And when it comes to military and strategic priorities, the U.S. believes that it has that its current approach to the Arctic is sufficient in order to reach their goals for the Arctic. However, Russia has taken earlier long-term decisions regarding the region and how to expand their economic and military capabilities. The United States, on the other hand, has just in recent years begun to question whether their recent strategies for the Arctic have been enough. This thesis argued that despite the increase of military presence and resources spent on Arctic military capabilities, the international community should not expect military presence on the levels that it was during the Cold War. And the reasons for this is that the current level of military activity in the region is minimal when compared to that of the Cold War period. And in addition to this, the majority of Russian military activity in the region seems to focus on protecting other Russian interests in the region, such as their energy infrastructure. When it comes to the development of trade routes in the Arctic, this research has argued that even though there's an increase of shipping in the NSR is still expected to remain a domestic trade route as a tool of developing Russian natural resources in the region due to the technological challenges, harsh climate, and financial cost it would be for the Russians to develop the NSR into a global shipping route. Russia and the US have taken two different approaches to UNCLOS. Russia had decided to ratify the agreement and has in recent years claimed to have sovereign authority over a large portion of the areas beyond their 200 nautical mile border. These areas have a great potential for oil and gas exploration and exploitation. The US, on the other hand, have decided not to ratify the treaty. This research has argued that the United States not ratifying UNCLOS can be at a major disadvantage to them when it comes to claiming territory in the Arctic, due to the fact that they are not able to join the negotiation in the United Nations when the other countries are discussing the territorial claims through the UN channels. When it comes to future research, during the making of this thesis, an incident occurred that will most likely affect the development in the Arctic as well as other regions for years to come. This incident, as I mentioned previously, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. On February 21st, 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced that they recognize the independence of the two East Ukrainian regions of Donetsk and Luhansk in the Donbas region. 3 days later, on February 24th, Russia announced that their decision to undergo a special military operation in eastern Ukraine. Thus, the Russian invasion of Ukraine started. So far, the EU, NATO, and the West have responded to this invasion by implementing several sanctions and bans. Some of these are cutting several different Russian banks from the SWIFT service and banning Russian civilian aircrafts from entering EU airspace. Another implication of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that several EU countries have announced the opportunity of banning or stopping the import of Russian oil and gas. In addition to this, the two Arctic countries, namely Sweden and Finland, have decided to apply for NATO membership. If Finland and Sweden become NATO members, the border between NATO countries and Russia would be some 1,340 kilometers longer. This is something that would massively affect the power dynamics in the Arctic. In addition to this, if the EU decides to stop the import of oil and gas from Russia, this will have a huge effect on the power dynamics in the region when taking into account that more than 50% of Russia's oil and gas export goes to the EU and UK. The implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine are something that will most likely affect the developments in the Arctic and is something that future research should focus on. That was everything from me. Do you guys have any questions?
Thank you very much for your presentation, Espen.
Thank you.
Yes, I would like to repeat the same question actually to the audience. Are there any questions? Perhaps I can take the advantage of being the moderator of today's session and pose one question to you. You have two cases. Okay, there's actually one question coming from Defne Hoca too. It says, what is the role of the Arctic Council in this great power rivalry? And
sorry.
Maybe we can have two questions for you to reflect upon. So that's the first one. And my question was about how you see the factors that led to different approaches of different US administrations as far as the Arctic is concerned. So Obama administration, as you highlighted, was based on the analysis of your data. It revealed that this administration was more concerned about the preservation of the Arctic climate, whereas Trump administration was more focusing on promoting offshore oil and gas development in the Arctic. So my question was, how do you see the factors, the elements that led to such distinct approaches coming from two different US administrations?
Yeah, to answer the last question, first, there are different factors, one of them being that, of course, Barack Obama was a part of the Democrats. He was there for 8 years, 2 terms. What's quite common in US politics is that after one president served at least 2 terms, they tend to have a shift to the opposite. And the opposite is of President Obama's policies was, in this case, Donald Trump, with a more emphasis on increasing US energy and capabilities of the US in the region, as the complete opposite of what Barack Obama had. He did see some obstacles, as I mentioned, the moratoriums for how basically protection of the Arctic region. You could also see it, of course, in their approach to NATO, with Donald Trump being quite vocal about how NATO is not working. Of course, that might show differently now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Even Emmanuel Macron, for not that long ago, said that NATO is not necessary anymore, which probably was proven quite wrong. Donald Trump also emphasized the 2% limit. Every country should invest at least 2% of their GDP into NATO, whereas Barack Obama was not that. He didn't emphasize the role of NATO as much as Donald Trump did. When it comes to the role of the Arctic Council in the great power rivalry, it's more of a institution where all the Arctic countries come together and, in a sense, cooperate on a lot of different aspects, such as protecting the natives living in different countries in the Arctic, protection of environment. It has nothing to do with UNCLOS, for instance. It's a different thing. So it's more of a institution where you can voice your concerns and also try and cooperate. It's been an institution focusing on cooperation for the entire time of its existence, basically. I don't know if that answered your question enough, Daphne.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the answer as well. My question is actually, is the United States and Russia still oriented towards Arctic Council? Do they care about the Arctic Council?
Yeah, most definitely. Both Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Vladimir Putin, their administrations have all been quite involved in the Arctic Council, and it's mainly there, as I said, to protect the natives or the natives living in these areas, as well as protecting the environment. Of course, it's different scales of how much these countries actually want to protect the environment. Barack Obama's administration was more focused, as I said, on protection of environment. Donald Trump and Putin let's just say a bit less. Thank you.
Thank you for your responses, Espen.
Thank you.
Are there any additional questions? If there are no additional questions, then I would like to thank you, Espen, for your presentation once again. And also I would like to thank our participants. I would like to thank in particular to our assistant, Melis, for helping us with technical matters here. So in that sense, I would like to conclude today's session. Thank you very much to all once again. Have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.